actually to what is the third Buddhadeva Bose annual lecture. This series began at the initiative of Buddhadeva Bose's younger daughter, Damanti Bose, who had edited, I will say edited, because although I was the one credited with editing it, she was the one who initiated this Oxford University Press book on the selected English writings of Buddhadeva Bose was published in September 2018. But she is the person that took initiative actually. Initially, she contacted the center telling us that she wanted to donate her father's books and her father's materials and whether we could take care of them, which of course we were very glad to be able to accept and then to initiate. That was a while ago. It was in 2018 that we formed. I mentioned 2018 because that is the year we formally inaugurated. If you go upstairs at the end of this lecture, you will see that there is a room dedicated to the memory of Buddhadeva Bose, which has his writing table, it has his armchair and standing lamp and bookcases with books inscribed to him in them. As well as upstairs in the library, of course, his entire book collection. So these are now with the center, and we are doing our best to look after all of this since they were given to us. The room was inaugurated in 2018 at the time that the book that was edited on the selected English writing was launched. Damanti unfortunately left us very soon after, but I think it's only appropriate that we begin these events with remembering her initiative in getting all of this going. I don't think any of this would have happened without her indomitable will actually to make it happen. We then had the first two actually lectures that were delivered had to perforce be online because the pandemic had struck, and in 2020 Shopun Chakraborty spoke on Kobi, Kobita, Porotantra. That was an online event. In 2021, Said Manzurul Islam spoke from Dhaka, in fact. He was formerly at the University of Dhaka and is currently at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. And that event too was online. This now, the third Buddhadeva Bose lecture, is the one that we have returned to the physical format to, and we are very glad that we have been able to do that. So this is the third Buddhadeva Bose lecture. The title is up on the wall behind you. True Confessions of a Literary Translator. And the speaker today is, of course, the poet, writer, critic, translator, Arvind Krishna. I will, to try and summarize everything you've done in a lifetime, Arvind, is impossible. So I will just give you the bare minimum, as much as really should be said before Arvind begins to speak. So I was looking up how to describe Arvind. And I thought the best sort of recourse I could take would be to a 2020 publication from NYRB, New York Review of Books. They published Arvind Krishna Mehrotra selected poems and translations. And they introduced him by saying, I'm quoting, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra is one of the most celebrated Indian poets writing in English and an important translator from Indian language. His poetry, they continue, quote, combines the commonplace and the strange, the autobiographical and the fabulous, and reflects an intense and original engagement with American poetry, especially the work of William Carlos Williams and the Beats. Now, this is an NYRB publication, as you understand. So, one should add then that this engagement, of course, was strategic, involving the fashioning of an escape route, perhaps, from the Queen's or King's English and English literature. Because the engagement, of course, also includes Ezra Pound, Indian history, Prakrit poetry, and a great deal that came to him from the books on his uncle's bookshelf. Arvind Krishna Mehrotra was born in Lahore, raised in Allahabad, and now lives in Delhi. He began his career as an editor of the uniquely named Damn You, a magazine of the arts, published from Allahabad between 64 and 68. This was quickly followed by Ezra, published from Bombay at the Ezra Fakir Press. I'll try and show you images of the covers of some of these because the wonderful artwork of these magazines was on display at SOAS this summer at an exhibition organized at the Brunei Gallery titled Crafting Subversion, DIY and Decolonial Print. And I managed to take some photographs so you'll be able to see some of the covers in a moment. So he is by now the author of 7 books of poetry and 2 collections of essays, Partial Recall and Translating the Indian Past. He is also the translator of The Absent Traveler, Prakrit Love Poetry, and Songs of Kabir, and the editor of 2 hugely influential interventions in the study of modern Indian poetry and writing, the Oxford India Anthology of 12 Modern Indian Poets, and a History of Indian Literature. His old and long friendship with Marathi poet Arun Kulapkar culminated in his edition after Kulapkar's death of Collected Poems in English by Arun Kulapkar. Mehrotra has translated more than 200 literary works from the ancient Prakrit languages and from Hindi, Bengali, and Gujarati. More recently, he has brought out the Book of Indian Essays, 200 Years of English Prose. This came out in 2021. He has reached the stage now where various selected poems and collected poems keep appearing from time to time. His selected poems and translations were shortlisted for the Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry, and his collected poems was published by Shearsman Books in 2020. I wish to mention one last very slight publication out this year, which is a personal favorite of mine. Ghalib, a Diary, Delhi, 1857 to 1858, which is a narrative that is based on Ghalib's Dastan work, reflecting on the events and upheavals of 1857. So, I will end this introduction with the few images that I promised to show you. Devojyoti, একটু image গুলো একটু বাড়ানো যাবে ইমেজের সাইজটা দেখো Okay, that's fine. So just actor for actor. So with that, over to our speaker for today, Arvind Krishna.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. It's a great honor to be here and to be delivering this lecture. Am I audible? If I'm not audible, please raise your hand and I'll speak a little louder or more clearly. But thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to deliver this. I thought long and hard because I don't know very much about my great shame about Buddhadeva. He's a kind of figure you have always heard about for as long as he's been alive. This name has been at the back of my mind. And I tried to imagine this figure over and over again. And some of this short introduction to him, this evening is a sort of lecture is in 2 parts. One is I'm imagining Buddhadeva, and the other is the title of this. The 2 things are connected. So online, when I went online and I researched some Buddhadeva, I came across this very interesting piece in Jacket, an online magazine called, I think, in Jacket 36, which I forget the author, but again he thanks Damayanti for her incredible help and her enthusiasm for searching out certain letters between Buddhadeva Bose and George Oppen. So it's a connection which I've known for a long time. And it's a very interesting connection with Ezra Pound, because George Oppen's first book was introduced by Pound in the around the 1930s. And I don't know how many people know this, but Buddhadeva also published Ezra Pound. Do people know this at all? I suppose they do. Kavita Bhavan, is that the house? Yes. So they published a small Ezra Pound book, I think the conclusion, the analects, the unwobbling pivot. And it's a slim book. And that appeared in the 40s, or maybe 48. I have a reference to that. So it's a very strange connection between Pound, Bose, and George Oppen. And all this is happening in the 1840s, 1850s. Then 1940s, yes, Oppen is 1930 to 1948, Buddhadeva publishes this. Then they meet, George Oppen and Buddhadeva meet in New York. And there is this very interesting conversation, in exchange of letters between the two about Buddhadeva Bose's, he did his own translations, of course, then Oppen did something with them. And that exchange is very interesting, which thanks to the researcher, thanks to Damayanti, who discovered one letter. She said that she went through the entire file, all his papers, she came to discover the letters from Oppen to Buddhadeva. But the letters that Buddhadeva wrote to Oppen are there in the American libraries. So they are, some of those have survived. So one had known of Buddhadeva for a long time, and then as a reader of this American magazine Poetry Chicago, his name would come up over and over again. But this is a very mysterious figure who appears in Poetry Chicago, for whom appearing just the last comment. First time he appeared in the 1950s. And strangely, there is no page on Buddhadeva in the Poetry Chicago website. So it's really trial and error. So a lot of poems come up, and suddenly, but there is no bio note, there is no. And I discovered a poem by him from 1950 in Poetry Chicago. And that same poem, which I'm going to read, is not, I don't anyone even knows of it. And then I tracked it down, and it appears in an special issue of the Atlantic Monthly of 1951 or 52, which has Nehru on the cover. And that has Buddhadeva, of course, the same poem. And really Amiya Chakrabarti, Nayankara Sehgal, those writers who are there in the newly independent India, 1951-52. If someone wants, I should try. But if you just go to Atlantic Monthly and if you Google enough, you trace that. That's a very interesting issue of what the literary scene was like around 1952, as observed by the Atlantic. And that poem, which appeared in poetry, which I'm going to read out. You see, when we were growing up, we would remember the Buddhadeva Bose's famous, attack on the Indian writer in English, and this is a K and this is a cul-de-sac, and that. But all that's besides the point. So anyway, so I'm going to the introduction to Bose is called A Bite of Bose, but this is after the greatest on gastronomy and eating. And I've obviously got one thing hugely wrong. I checked with Jadunath. I always imagine him smoking a pipe, but he never smoked a pipe, he smoked a cigarette. But I'm imagining this man, and this essay is about that. Anyway, of writers as of places or people, what you retain are bits and pieces. Put together, they make a picture of the writer, the place, or the person. The picture is necessarily incomplete, temporary, and changing. But it is all you have to go on the next time you read the writer or run into the person. When I think of Buddhadeva Bose, I do not see a face. I cannot recollect seeing a likeness of him, though I must have. It may have been a sketch, even a photograph. If so, I see a typically Bengali face, if there be such a thing. In other words, I see nothing. I see a pipe. Where could the pipe have come from without the face? There is a Rene Magritte painting of a pipe, but that's not the one I want. I once used to smoke a pipe. Maybe that's why Buddhadeva's pipe has stayed with me. A pipe comes to you stark naked, like a newborn, and must immediately be swaddled in a smoking pipe bag. Mine was of suede leather. It had two compartments, one for the Capstan flake tobacco and another for the pipe cleaner, and the rest of the paraphernalia. I was a student in the late 1960s when I first heard of Buddhadeva. The pipe, my pipe, that is, came only a little later after I got a job and my first salary. So Buddhadeva then was a face, though not a particular face. He was a pipe, though not a particular pipe. He was also a phrase, and the phrase is comparative literature. I used to wonder what it meant. I still do. There is a book with a red jacket. The jacket is brittle or has become brittle over the years. The bookcase in which it is kept faces a window, and the window faces the sun. I sometimes forget to draw the curtain, and the spine has faded. The spine was once red. A spine that was once red has become white. The book edited by Bose is called An Anthology of Modern Bengali Literature. It is not with me at present, and I could be slightly wrong about the title. Many of the translations are by Bose himself, and I recall the names of the younger poets in it. Jadunath, Binoy Majumdar were both there in that. When I started writing, I came across Jyotidas' translations of Binoy Majumdar in Tribe Portuguese. You remember that? Binoy Majumdar in Tribe Portuguese. So all this is late 1960s, early 1970s. Someone must have given me the book. It could have been the Chitre. I have Chitre's anthology of Marathi poetry, and both these books, Chitre's and Bose's, appear to have been part of a series. I too wanted to edit an anthology. I also wanted to translate, though from the Hindi. I wanted to be like Bose. Bose was a Bengali writer, but that's not how I saw him. I saw him as someone who wrote in a European language, Spanish, say, or French. This became yet another reason why I wanted to be like him. In the 1960s, if you were a poet and wanted to see your work in print, you started your own little magazine. This is what Zika was showing. Together with two Allahabad friends, I started one. It was Cyclostyle, and we did all the work ourselves. Now, through these little magazines, or through this network of little magazines, people heard of us, and a few American and British poets sent their poems. This was the time of the hungry generation, and they were waste paper, you know that. It was enough for us to feel we were part of an international community. By the fourth issue, we were giving the magazine a US price, 50 cents, even though its print run was never more than 75 copies, and we had no US distribution, much less a bank account to deposit the 50 cents in. We were BA students. There were to be 2 more issues before the magazine folded, but it had done its job. Bose was a cosmopolitan, a literary man of the world. Age 17, I had the same dream for myself. There was something else too, which I've only come to know now. We associate the beginnings of modern Indian poetry in English with Nissim Ezekiel and his first book, A Time to Change, published in 1952. No one realized that by then, quietly, unnoticed, Bose had already changed it with the Petrarchan sonnet. To an unknown dead, appeared in the February 1950 issue of Poetry, Chicago. And this is the poem which appeared in, it's not there in the KPP's edition of the selected poems. I thought it might be there, but it's not there. So it's never been published. It can only be found in the February 1950 issue of Poetry, Chicago. And this is the poem, To an Unknown Dead. And this is 14 lines, 8 lines and 6 lines. I could never have believed her dead when they carried her along the afternoon street, followed by mourners, themselves so purified that their unhurried, unhesitant feet seemed to tread on air. And 2 or 3 in a closed, slow-pacing car, sitting erect and gazing straight ahead, seeing nothing. The traffic made way, passers-by paused, but I could never believe again. Beautiful and calm, her face held up to the stooping sun, beautiful, open, full and whole, she was like a fruit just ripened, without embarrassment, effort, or hope. No longer waiting for something to happen, but final, perfected, ready to drop. He's talking about what each character is. The experience of reading this poem is like watching a state funeral. Though the person whose fatigue it is herself unknown. It is says to an unknown dead. That's the title. The first 8 lines move slowly, as though they themselves were in mourning. The last 6 bring the poem to a standstill, as the poem takes a final look at the dead face. The consonants soften, calm, open. He repeats beautiful twice. Then comes the crash of the concluding 3 words, ready to drop. Throughout, full rhymes are mixed with slant rhymes, internal rhymes with end rhymes. From the sound pattern, the poem does not feel like a translation, and the magazine does not say that it is one. Otherwise, Poetry Chicago always says, translated by the author. And all the other Buddhadeva verses. This is the one poem which he wrote directly in English. And neither does the Atlantic Monthlies they translated from English. It acknowledges poetry, but it says it's a poem. 20 years later, when Bose's poems again appeared in the same magazine, in the special translation issue of August-September 1970, some of the poets in it were Bose, Borges, Goethe, Attila Joseph, Ritsos, and Pushkin. The only other poet from the subcontinent, apart from Buddhadeva, was Galib, translated by Azaz Ahmad and W.S. Morgan. Through the worldwide web of literature, Buddhadeva Bose connected you to the great Europeans, but also to American poets like George Orwell and Ezra Pound, whose Confucius, the Unwobbling Pivot, and the Great Digest he had published from Kavita Bhavan in 1949. A poem by Oppen, To Memory, says below the title, from a poem by Buddhadeva Bose. This is the first of its 2 parts. And I'll read out this poem. This is a poem by Oppen, and it's To Memory. And then below that, George Oppen says, from a poem by Buddhadeva Bose. And this is Oppen, his take on the Bose translation. Who but the goddess? Question mark. Who but the goddess? All that is yours. The causes, beginnings are lost if you have lost them. But from your eyelids quiver flowers that are trampled spring in the gloom before us, and a landscape deepens hill behind hill, and the branches bend in that sunlight. The lute has no meaning, nor canvas nor marble without you, not the beaches that show the ocean, the womb of our mother. Galaxies shine in that darkness. O you who are darkness, the core of our darkness and illumination, what your hands have let fall is lost to us. This is to memory. What is not in the memory, what your hands have let fall is lost to us. To memory appears in the materials. That's where I first discovered it. It is George Appel's book called The Materials, published in 1962. It's a New Directions paperback, a very thin book. Appel's second book this was Appel's second book. His first was Discrete Series, published by the Objectivist Press in 1934, with a preface by Bhavan. So this whole Bose found connection to George Appel. A year after it was published, Appel, together with his wife, Mary, who was a painter, joined the Communist Party. And as Mary often puts it in her autobiography, Meaning of Life, they decided to leave our interest in the arts for a later time. They abandoned poetry. Both George Appel and Mary Appel, they were communists, and they had to disappear into Mexico during the McCarthy years. And then he gave up writing altogether. Appel didn't write. Bose first met Appel in New York in 1961. Born in the same year, this is very interesting. Both Appel and Buddhadeva were born in 1908. So they were exact contemporaries when they met. For Bose, it would have meant having someone like Appel translate his work. For Appel, who had recently returned to writing poetry after a long gap, he was away from poetry for 25 years. And in 58, 59, 60, started writing poetry again. That's when he discovered poetry. And for him, for Appel, it was like exploring the waters. What is it like to be translating? And I think at the back of his mind, he must have had Pound and Yeats doing Tagore. So that was then. And now here was another Bengali poet, and here was another American poet. And could he translate in the way Appel? Tagore translated. Eliot, Pound and Yeats helped bring Tagore over. Would often do the same. So the collaboration was important to both of them. What might it be like to carry across into the American idiom something that came from Bengal? Bose, who was widely seen as the literary successor to Tagore, felt that in the process of ferrying, much had been thrown into the Hudson. Bose was very unhappy with the American thing that was being done to his poems. So that correspondence is very interesting between them. It's back and forth. Only there are half a dozen, 4 or 5 letters that survive. It's what Ramanujan, translating a Tamil poem called Damages in Transit. The Bose felt that too much damage had been done to his Bangla by George Appel. In a letter of October 29, 1962, Bose wrote, I felt the essence of my poem in it. Although your style is very, very different. Though a few months before that, writing to him on March 3, the same year, 1962, he had, within inverted commas, appreciated this delicate compliment from a fellow poet. This, more than anything else, shows that the trouble I took over those translations has not been entirely wasted. You cannot know how inadequate those translations are, but even so, they have meant something to you, which I find very encouraging. Bose's letter seems to be in reply to the one of February 19 from Appel, in which Appel explained that much as he responds to Bose, and responds to this, he responds to Bose, he has also to be faithful to his first linguistic partner. And he's the American after all. So he has to translate Bose into American. I have, he wrote, as many people must have, an intense emotional response to the concepts, the thought of your work. Your form, since it has expressed it, is surely good form. It is simply not mine. My alteration is not meant as an attempt to correct your work. An intention is correcting. These are type letters. And I think Damayanti found this letter. I think she found it. My alteration is not meant as an attempt to correct your work, but only to assimilate it to the present American poetic diction of brevity. To make the experiment of the American voice and tone expressing these concepts, which I believe no American could form for himself. Bose's were the only translations or variations that often made. The struggle between original and translation, though the degree can vary, is seldom without violence. In the same letter of February 9, Oppens wrote about the poem Still Life. Still Life is a still freer version. It contains only the line, "What are you, Apple?" as a direct quote from your work, and is violently shortened to 6 lines. So in this poem, Still Life, the first line is a Buddhadeva Bose, the rest is by George Orwell. Assimilation has its costs. Buddhadeva Bose is the only Indian poet who was part of 3 literary constellations, the European, the American, and that of the subcontinent. That's how I see Buddhadeva Bose in my imagination. It may have nothing to do with Bose, but that's how I see him. But these letters that I've quoted from, if you go to Jacket, issue 36, you will find this entire correspondence which I quoted. Now, so another half an hour or 35, 40 minutes for my true confessions. I'm still continuing with the idea of translation. My earliest memory of translation is when I would translate without reading the original. I would have the original in front of me and I would read the language. But since I read slowly and without understanding all the words, I leave it alone and get on with the translation. I was, you could say, translating blind. I'd been writing since my mid-teens and was eager to write more, no matter how the writing came. When I started doing this thing that I'm talking about, of translating without knowing the original, which was a doha or couplet by Kabir in 15th century Hindi, and it in some ways felt similar to what I experienced when I wrote my own poems. There too, I tried to see as clearly as I could what was but a floating, indistinct shape before me. I could not always tell the two sensations apart, and to help me do so, I gave them name tags, calling one poetry and the other translation. The book I was translating from had a bilingual text. So I could, when I read the Kabir Doha, I was reading the English version printed below it. But the English was so inflated that it kept drifting away like a gas balloon, much like the Hindi original, though the latter escaped my grasp for different reasons. Kabir's language, as I was to learn, was earthy, whereas the language of the translation seemed not of the earth. Once in a while, in the English, I found something I could hold on to, something recognizable, familiar. I had already discovered Ezra Pound, and Pound had said, go in fear of abstractions. You see, we were coming out of Sri Aurobindo, we were coming out of, all kinds of Sarojini Naidu. We were in 1964, 65. What do we do with Sri Aurobindo and Sarojini Naidu? So we were looking for guides, and Ezra Pound became one of them. So he said, Ezra Pound said, go in fear of abstractions. So the translation I read consisted of little else. The translations were full of abstractions. Slowly there emerged through the bilingual fog a few lines of verse, a new poem written 450 years after Kabir's death by a young, inspired 21-year-old poet who bore my name. And the poem I translated was, be careful of women of gold, these perfumed mistresses Never sit by them alone, even if one is your mother. I don't think Kabir ever said this. I don't know who said it. But at 21, I thought this was very nice. Be careful of women of gold, because these perfume mistresses never sit by them alone, even if one is your mother. Well, anyway. Then another one went like this. This is more like this is not a complete. Pandits chanting the Vedas shall go, and go will those who listen to them. Nasotist yogis and bright intellectuals shall go. Go the sun and moon, the water and wind. Thus says Kabir, only those can remain whose minds are tied to the rocks. This is sort of more like the contest between Kabir and me. I would still say had no clear winner. If Kabir, the author, had me, the translator, on the ropes, I was back on my feet quickly. Masochist yogis and bright intellectuals are phrases that couldn't have been in any original. In boxing terms, one of the phrases might be likened to a jab and the other to a headbutt. One is an offense, the other a blatant foul. As a translator, I had in an 8-line poem managed to commit both. Seen in translation terms, that was a point scored. I really punched Kabir or headbutted him as a translator. After I'd done 6 of these translations, I sent them to a magazine that I'd come to know on the little magazine circuit. The magazine, edited by D.S. Kandros and David Weddell, and published by the University of Texas at Austin, was Delos, a magazine on and off translation. The poems were accepted, and in 1971, they appeared in the 6th issue, which also happened to be the last. The US magazine that published until then had names like the San Francisco Keeper's Voice and Salted Feathers. They were almost always mimeographed, and the pages were stapled together. But this one was printed and looked like a book. Along with the issue, Delos sent 25 off prints and paid $75, my first earnings from writing. Iowa City, Iowa. Now, by the way, David Weddell, at 1971, David Weddell, when the name slipped out of my memory, then reading Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath. Plath committed suicide because Ted Hughes was having an affair with David Weddell's wife, Asia Weddell. And then Asia, I think, also committed suicide. So it's this is that David Weddell, who was at that time in Texas, and he was, this I learned very, very recently, about 2 years ago. Iowa City, Iowa, 1971. I'd never been outside India before, but when the Ozark Airlines flight landed in Cedar Rapids, it was like coming home. I'd always dreamt of America, growing up in Allahabad. $8 per person was all the foreign exchange allowed in those socialist days. And my wife and I still had some saved when we arrived. Someone from the University of Iowa's International Writing Program met us at the airport and drove us to the Mehrotra, an apartment building on North Woodview Street, where we lived for the next 9 months. Anyway, so this Iowa trip was State Department inviting people from South Asia, Eastern Europe, to see the American dream, and I was only too happy to see them. So then they came to Iowa City one day, Robert Bly, this great American poet Robert Bly, and he was reading, among other things, his translations of Kabir. And this came to me as a great shock, because I was just 21, 22 years old, I wanted to translate Kabir, and then arrives Robert Bly, who'd already done Kabir, who'd already started his translations of Kabir. I had all along believed that I would be the first to translate Kabir into the modern idiom. But here was this famous American poet who had beaten me to it. In the same way that I had based mine on someone's English or someone else's English, Bly, who had no Hindi. I can say I had more Hindi than Bly. but this much I can say for myself. That is that. At least I may not know Kabir, but at least I can read the language. Lai, who had no Hindi, based his versions on Tagore's 100 poems of Kabir. And he sold thousands of copies of Lai's Kabir. After the reading, I went up to Lai and gave him that Delos of print. I introduced myself. A few days later, Lai's chapbook, published by Lila Guerrero Press, arrived in the mail. Kabir, the fish in the sea is not thirsty. This is a little pamphlet about Lai. My Kabir project had ended before it had begun. There was no way. For decades afterwards, my interest in translating Kabir came and went. He said, I did this in 21, published by Kabir when I was in my 60s. Other translations appeared by Charlotte Bodville, Linda Hess, Vinay Dharwardkar, all these very well known. I bought whatever Kabir editions were available and read both the text and the commentaries. Sometimes, when I liked the poem, I tracked it across editions, which meant reading different versions. Once in a while, when I made a translation half-heartedly, I check it anxiously against the original. Because you are up against Linda Hess and Charlotte Bodville and Vinay Dharwardkar. I worried about using anachronisms. In an essay on Edouard Vuillard, Julian Barnes has this very interesting line on the artistic process. And Julian Barnes, quoting Vuillard, says, you get there either in a flash or through old age. Either you get it, or you get it in your old age. Well, with my Kabir translations, I've got the register and used to translate in a flash. But it took me the old age to realize this, that I've got thing, but I was too scared at 21 practically. 40 years after my translation, when Delos appeared, I published in 2011 Songs of Kabir. To make it easier for bilingual readers to compare original and translation, the Indian edition has the original on the facing page, and both the Indian and US editions give the source of each poem. So I do say, published by Motilal Banarsi Das or published by Arvind Bhavan or whoever the publisher was, and give the KG with the tag. So here is one of the songs as it appears in Songs of Kabir. To tonsured monks and dreadlocked rastas, to idol worshippers and idol smashers, to fasting Jains and feasting Shaivites, to Vedic pundits and favor poets, the weaver Kabir sends one message. The news of death hangs over all. Only Ram's name can save you. Say it now. The worry I had about using anachronisms had gone out the window. Fear was replaced with embrace. No poet living in the 15th century could have dreamed of dreadlocked rastas and favor poets, except through the mind of the translator. And therein lies the paradox and mystery of translating poetry. The further you move away from certain originals, the closer you get to them. And what appears to be the translator's self-projection is self-effacement. The more you kill the original, that fight to the death, the more it lives. A.K. Ramanujan would tell the axe story to illustrate a point about folk tales. The woodcutter was asked how old his axe is. It belonged to my great-grandfather, he said, and has been handed down. The axe head has been changed a few times. The handle has been changed a few times, but it's still the same axe. The story can be adapted to Kabir, to the blues, to anything that is sung or told and is passed from person to person, traveling long distances by word of mouth, but seldom in the same form. A Kabir song comes in many versions. Individual singers would change the order and number of lines and add or drop words at will, as I certainly did. But despite the variations, it would, like the woodcutter's axe, remain the same song. Translators are singers too, and sometimes they join in the singing. So that is Should I end there? Or I have another couple of pages.
Please do. Go ahead.
No, I don't know for how long. Can I have a glass of water? Now, this is what I've always believed. I think to be translating from a language which you know is a great handicap. I'd love to translate from the Bangla. And I think my greatest advantage is that I can't even keep this quick. But I still try and do a bit of Shakti Chattopadhyay when I can. You can imagining what Shakti Chattopadhyay would try sound like. In any case. But the Prakrit which I've come to now, I can't read at all. I cannot read Prakrit. I cannot make any sense of the Prakrit. And yet one was able to do some Prakrit poems. But a lot of poets have done it working through intermediaries. You don't really have to know. A lot of Russian poets have been translated by, W.S. Bhavan translated Mandelstam with another American, Clarence Brown. So it can be done. So my Prakrit was done through that means. I could read Kabir's Hindi and some of it I could understand. The other language I translated from Prakrit, though it is written in the same Nagari script, I could not read at all, nor understand anything of, unless I had someone to explain it to. A lot of people have translated in this way by taking help of those who are familiar with the original. I sometimes think it may even be better for a poet to not know the original except for some scattered words in it. For the rest, she can trust her instinct and feel her way into the lines just as she would into her own. The world's literatures make the oddest of pairings. Among the best known American poems, which one that is as iconic as the Coca-Cola bottle, is William Morris Williams's The Red Wheelbarrow. And everyone, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. A poem that is strikingly similar, and this is what strikes me about literature, which is very similar to The Red Wheelbarrow, is a Prakrit poem. Exactly 2000 years separate the Prakrit, and the poem is wings hanging down, necks drawn in, sitting on fences as though spitted, crows get soaked in the rain. Spitted, in a spit, when you are cooking something on a fire. So wings hanging down, necks drawn in, sitting on fences as though spitted, crows get soaked in the rain. Now, when I read this, I think 2000 years ago, these guys were doing William Morris Williams. And the crows gets a red wheelbarrow, that becomes the scene of American pastoral. The poems like Williams's, clean, minimal, hard enough to drive a nail in and hang your shirt on, have always been around. It's just that they were read differently. Poets notice the same things. And as these two poems show, the fleeting has a greater chance of being preserved than the momentous. And this I've always felt in literature, that what passes notice gets preserved. And great events can happen in history, and they're entirely forgotten. But the millions of people may have died, thousands of years ago, in whatever, volcanic eruption, massacres, all that is forgotten. But a crow sitting in the rain, and someone watching it and putting it down in a Prakrit Gatha in first century AD, that has survived these 2000 years. A cyclone that in ancient times flattened the city and killed hundreds leaves no trace on the human record, whereas a spell of rain does. I translated the Crow poem. This is my translation, and some 200 others of the Prakrit Gathas, just enough to make a small book, The Absent Traveler, Prakrit Love Poetry from the Gatha Sapshati. This is Satwan Hans. Actually, the first edition I came across of the Gatha Sapshati is from the Asiatic Society. They have a Gatha Sapshati. I forget who is it by. Yeah. That's the one. Very literal. That was the first one. So, the events of amorous life are so trivial, Barthes says in A Lover's Discourse, that they gain access to writing only by an immense effort. So this is the great insight he has in this, that the events of amorous life are so trivial. And the events of amorous life, a woman is looking at a man or a man is looking at a woman, and it's so trivial, these events. But yet, when they take into writing, there's a lot of effort. The Gatha Sapshati or the 7 centuries is an anthology of 700 verses in the Gatha form. They are poems of amorous life, very much so. A little like Japanese poetry of the Heian period. In them, no event is too trivial to go unnoticed. A glance, a touch of a hand, a tug of a garment. And the most trivial observation, a woman pointing to a tooth mark on a berry. You know, a woman pointing to a tooth mark on a berry. The poem just says this woman pointed, I think, the juju berry. The woman just looks at it with the tooth mark. And then that's the entire poem. Now, then the commentator gets into the act. The commentator, what is she saying? Why is she showing her husband? Now, the commentator, Gangadhar, then in the 16th century would say, woman is telling the man that the child is now a year old, yes, she's ready for love, nothing wants to go. So these little gestures that happen, no one could have dreamt this, that this is what a tooth mark on a berry, it's just 2 lines, it's a gatha, it's a couple. So, anyway, it's seen as an event in amorous life. The language is Prakrit, which along with Sanskrit is one of the classical languages. Now, occasionally, and this was all in the Deccan, this is happening between the Godavari and the Tara. Occasionally, we find in the Gatha Sapshati poems in which something in the natural world is described. It might be a bee sitting on a white jasmine, a sow in a field, a roe bull, a frog. Now, since the context in the anthology is love poems, the innocent looking scene by intrepid commentators is transformed into an erotic drawing. But this is very interesting because if you forget the commentators, if you forget Gangadhar, 16th century. Now, all this is, the poem is 4 legs positioned on the bank, hinders agitating in the ripples, a she-frog strokes her own reflection. It's a simple enough poem. It's a she-frog looking at her reflection in the pond. A she-frog, hinders agitating in the ripples. Now, just as we might say that the William Carlos Williams poem is about red wheelbarrows, is about a red wheelbarrow, we might say that this is a poem about a frog sitting by a pond. Except that it is not. Now, Gangadhar, who in the 16th century wrote a commentary, says of this poem, the heroine desirous of contrary intercourse to her lover. What at first appeared to be a description of something observed in nature turns out to be something very different. It is almost as if it was self-evident. The way Gangadhar says, this is what is happening. There is obviously, she is suggesting a sexual position. So she's saying, go and look at that. If a frog sitting by a pond to Gangadhar suggests contrary intercourse, what might he make of the crows in the poem quoted earlier? Now, he also has a little story about that. Why is this? What is the crows getting soaked in the rain? Then he will say that, okay, now what she's doing is she's telling her lover, not hurry up with the love. Take your time, take it easy. It's raining, so no one is going to come here. So what are you telling you? So what is very simple, and then of course, in the rest of the paper, I try and imagine what the red wheelbarrow, what Gangadhar would have made of the red wheelbarrow. Instead of being a pastoral poem about America, it might be a sexual poem for example. So I want to go into it. How do we know? Okay, such a reading. According to Gangadhar, by drawing his attention to the rain, The heroine indicates to her lover that the lovemaking need not be rushed through, since no one is now likely to be disturbed. Such a reading tempts one to look at the red wheelbarrow again, this time through Gandharva's eyes. By drawing his attention to the farmyard scene and the wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens, what might the heroine of William's poems be suggesting to her lover? Were we to come across the red wheelbarrow, not say in the Northern Anthology of American Literature, Volume 2, but in an anthology of classical Indian verse, we read it as a love poem. Now, my absolute last paragraph. This is, you could have been traveling west all your life, only to realize at journey's end that while you've been facing east. So sorry. There is one, there is I'm skipping, no, I'm not skipping, I'm just summarizing this. There is a poem which I quote over and over again by Arvind, and it's from Jejuri. And it's a 14-line poem. And it says, that's no doorstep. It's a pillar on its side. Yes, that's what it is. This is all what the poem says. Now, 14 words to the 16, and it has 2 words less than the red wheelbarrow. The poet is Arun Kulakar, who knew his Williams as he did his Data Sapshati. It was he who told me about the Data Sapshati when he was reading. And the doorstep is from Jejuri. Thousands of people have crossed that doorstep. They've always thought of it as a temple thing. No one actually looked at it and said, okay, this is not temple pillar, it's just a doorstep. The truth is that ordinary folk live in their fanciful heads, whereas it is the poet who sees the world clearly. Williams's eternal moment is a moment of seeing, but refined, clarified, and intensified by what he called the imagination. So when Kulakar sees the doorstep, this is his imagination, which is seeing what is before the eyes. Which is why the wheelbarrow is red, the chickens are white, and the pillar is a pillar and not a doorstep. Literature is not a series of arcs. One arc English, the other Prakrit, one American, the other Indian, one 20th century, the other 2nd century, but an unbroken circle. And this is the last paragraph that is coming. You could have been traveling west all your life, only to realize at journey's end that all the while you'll be facing east. You see, I go all the way to William Carlos Williams to discover the Prakrit Data Sapshati. It is ironic that I had to learn from Pound and Williams the same lessons that Kabir and the Prakrit poets could have taught me. The direct treatment of the thing, everything that Pound said, I could have learned from these fellows, Kabir and the Prakrit poets. Direct treatment of the thing, the music inherent in the spoken voice, all this was part of our own tradition. Not that it really matters where one learns, the lessons do not change and can be found in many places. Pound himself learned this from the Chinese. All ages are contemporaneous in the mind, he said. Translation provides you with a new map of the world. Speaking for myself, living in Allahabad, I had stumbled my way to a street in Rutherford, New Jersey. And without leaving, it emerged centuries later in the Deccan, not far from Bombay. Every writer carries this map in her head. But even she cannot know all of it, for the map, much to Google Earth's consternation, is constantly changing. I'm sorry to produce so much.
Thank you very much.
I will open this up to questions if there are any questions or comments. Otherwise, if Arvind is exceptionally lucky, we can let him go without further interrogation. But does anybody have any questions? Yes. We do.
Very too short, so no, without a question, which we are dishonored to speak. So I was thinking that your title, True Compassion. Now I was thinking about whether why did you frame as a true compassion, which means that there are false compassions of any literary translator. So my provocation to you is that you have any example of false compassions of any literary translator that you are aware of? That's number one question. 1A is why it has to be compassion? I don't know whether you have a Christian background or not. Why not like a true reflection? Or,
I just wanted to give it a catchy title, that's all. I don't have a plan in my head. True confession, magazine sort of, true confession. Like a girly magazine of a certain day. So it was more that. But I had no. I didn't have any.
It is an habit of people in academics to dig deep into every word, which is what we do. Yeah. So, my question.
Thanks, Arvind. That reading of Red Wheel, so interesting. I mean, your speculation later on, if it were a rapid one. Thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. One of them related to the question that your rereading of the Red Wheel, which I think originally is an untitled poem. It was began to be titled in the anthologies as the Red Wheelbarrow, though it was just number so and so, right, in that sequence. And that title, of course, changes the way we think about it and almost puts too much weight on the Red Wheelbarrow. But what I wanted to ask you in connection to that is maybe slightly academic and boring, is that were we to kind of respond to the way you've asked us to read the Prakrit poems, or the way the commentator, is it Gangadhar? Yeah, is so in such a natural way, reading a poetry of detail, as also a poetry that is situated in a kind of human theater of some kind. You know? So there is on the one hand you have the poetry of the concrete, the crows. On the other hand, something else is being narrated
By the commentator.
By the commentator. According to him, it exists in the poem. You know. But you are drawn to the concrete, as is William. Is there a way of then setting aside this demarcation between the dramatic and the contemplative? So if the Red Wheelbarrow is a contemplation, which immediately gets kind of diffuse, if we then not diffuse, but it takes on a slightly different meaning if we then begin to see it as an episode that plays a part in a kind of episode to do with others. But it still remains a meditation. Right? It's still the details are still alive. It's only in the way we have been taught to read that we think that details should be presented to us in a moment, or they take on a new life as we contemplate But the moment they become part of an episode, they take on another meaning. And this is how we talk to people. But I'm just presuming that Gangadhar didn't have trouble with also engaging with the reality of the crows, right? The reality of the crows did only become part of it's an exchange. That there is a lot of time. It's raining. So I was interested in the demarcations that we ourselves subscribe to when we read poetry or theater or whatever, where one becomes incompatible with the other. The moment I'm thinking of Red Wheelbarrow as part of the conversation between two lovers, I'm no longer seeing it as a meditation of the Red Wheelbarrow and on the particular. That was one thing. And the other one was your very gently polemical kind of statement towards the end that the momentous gets forgotten.
Yeah.
The momentous gets forgotten. Here, millennia after millennia, it's the spell of rain, the cloudburst, or the crow that survives. The momentous is forgotten, which reminded me of various other things, including Chotajit Rising. Some of the worst films have been made on the noblest of themes. So I guess over there the momentous wasn't forgotten in the films that he was talking about. So is this something that you said it in a very gentle way, but is this something that poetry and poets and writers need to fight for again and again and again through those millennia? The fight is forgotten. We've forgotten the momentous, we've also forgotten the fight. The fight that made the moment with the crow possible. Because right now, Indian writing in English would seek to disprove what you said. But only the momentous is worth, recording.
To answer your first question, I think there is a whole, I'm not very familiar with it, but there is a whole tradition of reading in the Sanskrit conventions. So this whole entire text, the Gata Sapshati, has been read by another commentator as religious proof. It's a peculiarly Jain text. It's about all kinds of, so it's attracted at least 3-4 very well-known commentators. I'm not familiar with all of them. I just picked on the Gangadhar because it was, I feel closer to it, than the Jain commentator. But there is exactly 700 poems, but it has a completely different take on that entire text. So I think there must be a tradition of commentary, of commentating on these texts and coming at them from a particular angle, and then sticking to that angle from beginning to end. Whether you have to twist your argument or you have to stay and keep saying that these are Jain points. So that is one sort of. I think we are trained to look at it, even preconditioned. Like I was thinking about the Red Wheelbarrow. It's always that it's an American passport, that is about. But it was not the Red Wheelbarrow, as you say. It appears as a number in spring and all. When it first appeared, they were all numbered points. So that is one. And about this, they are so caught up with the momentous all the time, especially now with news and with all that sort of thing. There is no time to notice these details. There is no time to notice the fleeting. And now this whole thing with climate change is upon us. So it becomes harder and harder. But the moment you look at these things, a track left by a squirrel on a stone or something like that, a mark made by a mason in an old temple, so that will remain. That is, I've come across this over and over again. That something noticed in a piece of writing or prose or verse or whatever. So I don't know, but it's getting. Well, even that Kulakar poem, that's the doorstep, it's a pillar on its side. But suddenly to notice something, that this is what it is. But I think people could go through life without, seeing it. This is the word of the Kulakar burden, Kulakar. I've not answered the question, but it's all right. Yes.
Very simple question. I would like to ask you, I translate occasionally Bengali poetry sometimes. So I would like to ask a simple question. Do you see any changes in the tradition of translating through the ages? Like before how it was, now how it is, of postmodernism, you can call it postmodernism, but is the tradition of translation experiencing a change? Like the kind of translators we are getting, the kind of translations we're reading. Is it seeing some changes down the
Yeah, really, I wouldn't know how to answer that. Because I think, I've only basically I've just translated some Hindi poems, modern Hindi poems. I've translated some Nirala, a few poems by Nirala, a few poems by Bhavan. And I can really talk of I just try and, I try and stick very close to these modern poets, as much as I can. With Jadunath also translated some Shakti, a few poems, half a dozen poems by Shakti. And then we stuck very close to it, so you can't fool around with that, with those poems. But with Kabir, when the text is so fluid to start with, and then you don't know what you are translating. So it depends on, that is my own take, with that. But also the other thing is you can only translate in your own idiom. So I cannot invent another language to translate. But how translation has changed over, I think Ramanujan has been very important. I think that has been one crucial moment in translation. So there is a before Ramanujan and there is a post Ramanujan. That certainly opened the eyes not only of our but certainly of the Western Academy. That the Tamil poems, they have to be. And then there becomes this very interesting exchange between Ramanujan's own poems, and Ramanujan has said that he wouldn't have written his poems the way he has written them were it not for his discovery of the Tamil. So it's a two-way process, he's translating them, but he's also, and all his reading of American poetry has gone into translating those Tamil poems. So people have deferred very respectfully. They've said no, but he kind of chose what suited his idea of what.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was just thinking about the way you spoke about the difficulty of translating from a language that you know. So I was thinking, from where does this difficulty arise? So you are in a way speaking of a resonance being built up in the translation. So does access to language hinders this resonance? Hinders this resonance?
I'm partly being facetious when I say that. I don't take this seriously. I don't mean that. What I mean is, what I'm doing, you have to know what to feel. If it's something to escape, it's all right for some things to escape. I'm doing Mehrotra, some things. He invents certain words and I can't find them in the dictionary. I don't know what he Jalvash. Jalvash suddenly appears. Vash is steam from the Sanskrit. Jal is jal. I don't know why that phrase is there, but what is the line is a very beautiful line in which he's saying the ruins of the river reflected in the water. The ruins of the river are reflected in the river's own water. This is really incredible. But then it ends with Jalvash. I don't have the point there. I've been struggling with the Jalvash. I have, I've asked a lot of people that and he's too old. I can ask him, but he's 85. So then you have to guess your way. Then you have to give it up your hands. So it's but I like those moments. I like those moments. But the other thing is, if you get trapped in the original, you have well, you never get it. Then you lose your poem and you lose that person's poem. You lose at both ends. That's what my own feeling.
It is a point that Rabindranath makes as well. In Chimnapatra, Rabindranath actually says this, that firstly he talks about not knowing Sanskrit as a young boy in Ahmedabad. He's visiting Buddhadeva. And he says the sound of the Sanskrit is to him like the sound of distant drums. I mean, he can just hear the rhythm and the language. He doesn't know the language entirely. Some words make sense, they humor, but so he's doing a lot of translation when he's very young, as we know. So he's translating from not just from the Sanskrit, but also from other languages that he's not completely familiar with as well, German and French. So he actually makes this point. He says that you hear the sound of the language and you know a word here or there, but so yeah, he doesn't say it polemically, but yeah, it is a point that's there to let.
I was just thinking that like this has something to do with what does one mean by knowing a language? Because no one knows a language. So you encountered that when you begin to translate from a language into.
Yes, sometimes it's the word, sometimes it's the syntax, which I'm very confused about not much to syntax. And that they're very simple words. So these are some of the things you have to struggle with here. And I quite enjoy the struggle, I'm not saying.
Yes. If you stand, we'll be able to see you more clearly. Sorry.
The first discussion which came up was the problem of diction by diction. Because as you mentioned something about the earthiness in translating a certain poem, because I see that in a lot of cases when you translate, so diction can never break a poem. So if say in a certain period of poem for a certain similarly a high diction, and then when it is translated in a very different way, this is the case of sticky translation, where you read the poetry in
the mic is not working for you. Yeah, we can hear you.
So I was thinking of what do you think is the role of diction by translating poetry? Because I think even if you change diction by a little bit, you are translating to actually change the word. So how important do you consider it? Because the point that you made about Arvind as being a very, very notable trait that you would use for by translating, something that I found very, very interesting. So that is something that I'm very interested in.
My experience of that was when I was looking at the early Kabir translations, and they were published by the Baptist Mission Press in Kanpur in the 1920s. And so obviously, 1920s translations with these and thous. So obviously, I'm not going to. But when you read the original, then it is very early. Now, for instance, one Kabir poem for circumcision uses a word which is a very khatna. Now, I don't know if in Bangla you say circumcision khatna or you don't say, but in East UP khatna is, now he's talking about the caste system. So what he's saying is, did the Brahmins come out of another birth channel than the other communities? Is there a separate channel from which the Brahmin children come out? So, and then he said, if you are a true Muslim, then why didn't you have your khatna in your mother's womb? Then anyone can come outside the mother's womb and get himself circumcised. Now, this is a very, you can't say this in any flowery way. You have to say it straight as it is. So that is what I mean. So sometimes I think people either fight shy or they don't, they slur over certain things, at least at that time. I'm not saying that this is a poem that would have created a problem, but you have to match your diction. If it's a more formal diction, then you have to be a little more formal. But if it is earthy and it is,
but even there, your choice of American diction to get closer to the earthiness. The earthiness is there, certainly. Yeah, but you've chosen American diction, for a reason, as a translator.
The reason is that we don't have in English, our English is rather strict. So we call ourselves a convent educated English. Now, how earthy can you get in that? I cannot distinguish between Indian, American, and British. For me, they're all the same. It's sort of something called English. And sometimes I use something and someone goes from American, this is not quite American English. But for the spoken idiom, we always have a problem. And I think Kolhatkar was the person who broke through and said, okay, to have, he was doing Marathi. He was translating his own Marathi poems into English. And the Marathi is very old. And then, for instance, one poem in Marathi, but it's just the first line, it says, Ladu la. Ladu is Ladu. And Ladu la, Ladu la, Ladu la. And then when he translates it, he says, it's a boy, it's a boy, it's a boy. This is what the midwife is saying. You see, distribute ladus. Instead of saying ki ladka paida hua hai, he's saying ladu ka. So now, then he translates it into American. It's a boy, it's a boy. And then he talks about Mr. Nene. Then when Junior was born, so Junior is 100% American. So that's so he invented this for himself. Then others, then I realized when I was doing this with the show. So someone has to make that breakthrough. Because who was doing this in the 50s?
The original idiom is also invented. The original that Kolhatkar is writing is also partly invented. I mean, this Bombay Hindis, all kinds of stuff going into this book.
So that is the so the earthiness, how do we communicate the spoken idiom? We don't have Cockney, we don't have different registers. So what do we do? This is the whole problem with English. Writing in English, there's only one register in which we can write.
Arvind, you don't think that Kolhatkar felt the same thing about Marathi? Similarly, to say Hindi poets feeling about Khadi Boli, what do I do with this language? Alok, when I met him, he was talking about the conundrum that Khadi Boli presented for Hindi poets.
Yeah.
You see, all these lines that even had, how do we get out of it? So maybe this is something that has been experienced in other languages where you have a deadline. Just as you to escape into American or whatever.
Well, Hindi poets will have a huge problem with this. So which is what Ashok Shahane would tell you, why can't you understand Hindi poetry? Because he reads Hindi, I can understand Marathi. Look, in Tamil there is the same problem. There is, when you are writing, then you have to write a very formal Tamil. You cannot use the spoken. Whereas there is, I don't know in Bangla if that is true or not. It's not anymore.
Not.
But in Tamil, I've been told again and again, there is a literary Tamil and there is the spoken idiom and don't mix. But there is Hindi, they have a problem writing about man-woman relationship. There are no ways that you can express this. How do you write about something? This sort of areas of experience are just not written about. And certainly, you just can't say those.
So we've held you captive long enough. Unless there are any further questions, if anybody at all wants to. No? So with that, thank you very much, Arvind,
Thanks a
for
lot
making
for
the
having
time
me.
for coming here. Thank you for. And that is a small package of the centuries that I have meant to hand to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.